Mountain Man marries the most obese girl in town as a joke, but on their wedding night, she shocked him. The dusty saloon erupts in laughter as a Mountain Man slams his hand on the table. To prove he's no coward, he marries the most obese girl in town, right there before a jeering crowd. They all think it's a joke, a cruel dare under the church bell's toll. But when she steps into his lonely cabin the next morning, dignity in her eyes and a hymn on her lips, he realizes he may have married more than he bargained for, because this woman carries a secret that could change the town's future, a hidden claim to the land, and a voice powerful enough to silence mockery and stir hearts. Now, with the railroad closing in, with townsfolk sharpening their knives of ridicule, will this marriage built on a joke become his greatest shame, or the greatest redemption the West has ever seen? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The autumn wind whistled through Silverton's muddy streets as Theodore Hale pushed through the saloon's swinging doors. 6 weeks of trapping in the high country had left him with a leather pack full of prime beaver pelts and a powerful thirst. The warmth of the crowded room hit him like a wave, along with the familiar smell of tobacco smoke and spilled whiskey. "Well, if it ain't the Mountain Man himself," called Jimmy Walsh from behind the bar. "Thought the Grizzlies might have got you this time." Theodore dropped his heavy pack by the door, his boots leaving dusty prints on the wooden floor. "Takes more than bears to keep me from a proper drink," he said, his voice rough from disuse. The trapper's beard was wild, his buckskins weather-stained, but his eyes were bright with the prospect of civilization's comforts. The regulars made room as Theodore approached the bar. Jimmy already had a bottle waiting. "2 bits for the good stuff," the bartender said, holding up amber liquid that caught the lamplight. Theodore dug into his pocket, coins clinking. The first drink burned sweet down his throat, chasing away memories of lonely nights under cold stars. By his third glass, the room had grown louder, more jovial. A card game started in the corner and Theodore joined in, his pockets heavy with fur trading money. Hours passed in a blur of cards, whiskey, and exaggerated tales of mountain adventures. The room swayed pleasantly when Theodore stood to stretch his legs. That's when he heard the talk turn mean at a nearby table. "Saw that Carter girl today," sneered Tom Wilson, a ranch hand known for his cruel tongue. "Lord above, she gets bigger every month. Ain't a man in 3 territories that'd have her?" Laughter rippled through the group. "Lydia May? Why, 2 men could homestead in her shadow," another voice added, drawing more guffaws. Theodore knew of Lydia May Carter. Everyone in Silverton did. She was the largest girl in town, but he remembered her mostly from church services, where her voice rose pure and clear above the congregation. He'd never spoken to her, but something about the men's mockery stirred an anger in his whiskey-addled mind. "You're all wrong," Theodore heard himself say, turning to face the table. "I'd marry her myself right now." The room went quiet. Tom Wilson's eyes gleamed with malicious delight. "That so, Mountain Man? Prove it." Theodore's pride, inflamed by drink and 6 weeks of solitude, wouldn't let him back down. "Get the preacher. I'll do it tonight." The declaration sent the saloon into an uproar. Men rushed into the street, shouting and laughing. Theodore stood his ground, even as a small, sober voice in his head tried to warn him about what he'd just set in motion. Across town, Lydia May sat in her tiny room at Mrs. Peterson's boarding house, carefully mending a torn tablecloth by lamplight. The noise outside grew until heavy boots thundered up the stairs. Her door burst open, flooding the room with men's voices and tobacco smoke. "Come on, girl, you're getting married," Tom Wilson announced, his face flushed with drink and excitement. Lydia May set down her needlework with steady hands. "What foolishness is this?" "Theodore Hale's waiting at the church. Says he'll marry you right now." Someone else called out. The crowd pressed forward, eager for her reaction. They expected tears, protests, or anger. Instead, Lydia May stood slowly, smoothing her simple brown dress. "The Lord moves in mysterious ways," she said softly, though her cheeks burned with humiliation. They practically carried her down the street to where Reverend Matthews stood on the church steps, hastily dressed and clearly disapproving. Theodore waited there, swaying slightly, his expression unreadable in the darkness. The church's oil lamps cast weird shadows as the unlikely couple stood before the altar, the pews filled with townsfolk drawn by the commotion. their whispers echoing in the sacred space. Theodore could smell the pine soap Lydia May used, so different from his own wilderness scent of wood smoke and leather. "This is highly irregular," Reverend Matthews protested, but the crowd's energy wouldn't be denied. "Marry them, Reverend," came the calls. "Do it now." The ceremony was brief and lacking in dignity. Theodore mumbled his responses while Lydia May's voice remained clear and steady, as if this were any proper wedding. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, the crowd roared its approval. "Kiss her," someone shouted. "Kiss your bride, mountain man." Theodore hesitated, suddenly aware of the gravity of what he'd done. Lydia May turned her face up to his, her eyes reflecting the lamplight. There was no fear there, no anger, only a calm that made him more uneasy than any mountain storm ever had. He bent and pressed his lips briefly to her cheek, rough beard against soft skin. The crowd hooted and hollered, but Theodore barely heard them. In that moment, he saw something in Lydia May's expression that cut through his drunken haze, a dignity that all their mockery couldn't touch. The crowd began pushing them toward the door, laughing about wedding nights and marriage beds. Theodore felt the first real stirring of shame, but before he could speak, Lydia May addressed the assembly. "I thank you all for attending," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the church. "But I believe my husband and I have matters to discuss in private." Her use of the word husband struck Theodore like a physical blow. The men's laughter took on a different tone, suggestive and crude, but Lydia May ignored them. She turned to Theodore, her composure absolute. "Shall we go?" she asked simply. Theodore nodded, unable to find words. They walked together through the crowd, which parted before them. The night air was cool on their faces as they emerged from the church. Behind them, the celebration continued, but ahead lay only silence and the weight of what they'd done. Lydia May led the way to her boarding house, her steps unhurried. Theodore followed, his mind spinning with whiskey and consequences. At her door, she turned to face him. "I know this wasn't meant as a kindness," she said quietly, "but God has his purpose in all things, even drunken dares. We'll talk more when you're sober." Before Theodore could respond, she slipped inside, leaving him alone with the night wind and his growing sense of unease. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the closed door, while somewhere in the distance coyotes called to each other across the darkened valley. The magnitude of his reckless action began to settle over him like a heavy blanket. He'd meant to shame those who mocked her, but instead, he felt like the foolish one. Lydia May's quiet dignity had turned his grand gesture into something else entirely, something that would have consequences far beyond this night's entertainment. Theodore turned away from the boarding house and started walking, his steps unsteady. The stars wheeled overhead, cold and distant, offering no guidance. He'd come down from the mountains looking for civilization's comforts, and now found himself bound by civilization's laws in a way he'd never intended. The weight of the simple gold ring Reverend Matthews had produced seemed to burn in his pocket. Theodore had paid for it with fur money, not even counting the cost in his drunken haste. Now it represented a contract he'd entered into with all the wisdom of a spring fool. But it was Lydia May's eyes that haunted him as he walked through Silverton's empty streets, not accusing or angry, but filled with a certainty he couldn't understand. She'd looked at him as if she could see straight through his bluster to something he himself couldn't name. The night's chill began to clear his head, bringing with it waves of realization. He was married. He, Theodore Hale, who'd sworn he'd never be tied down, had a wife. And not just any wife, but one he'd chosen in a moment of drunken defiance, one the whole town would be talking about come morning. He found himself back at the saloon, now mostly empty. Jimmy Walsh looked up from wiping down the bar, shaking his head. "That was quite a show you put on, Theodore," the bartender said. "Never figured you for a marrying man." Theodore sank onto a stool, his head in his hands. "Neither did I," he muttered. The barroom's quiet was a stark contrast to the raucous scene of just hours before. Theodore could still hear echoes of the laughter, the cruel jokes, the way the crowd had seized upon his boast. But above all, he heard Lydia May's steady voice accepting her vows, as if she'd been prepared for this moment all along. He'd meant to mock the mockers, to throw their cruelty back in their faces. Instead, he found himself caught in something deeper, something that couldn't be dismissed with the coming of sobriety. Lydia May's words about God's purpose rang in his ears, challenging everything he thought he knew about chance and choice. The last patron stumbled out into the night, leaving Theodore alone with his thoughts and the lingering smell of spilled whiskey. Come morning, he'd have to face what he'd done in the cold light of day. But for now, he sat in the empty saloon, turning over and over in his mind the image of Lydia May's calm eyes, wondering what she saw when she looked at him, and what tomorrow would bring for them both. Theodore's head throbbed with the fury of 1,000 hammers as morning light pierced through the cabin's grimy window. He groaned, rolling over on his narrow bunk, memories of the previous night flooding back in fragments, cards, whiskey, the church. Lydia May. His eyes shot open, the marriage, dear Lord, what had he done? The cabin's familiar sense of wood smoke and cured leather did nothing to settle his churning stomach. Empty bottles littered the plank floor, testament to his foolishness. Surely it had been nothing but a drunken spectacle. Lydia May would be at the courthouse by now, seeking to undo their mockery of a marriage. A firm knock at the door sent spikes of pain through his skull. "Go away," he muttered, pressing his palms against his temples. The door creaked open anyway. Theodore squinted against the dawn light, making out a large figure silhouetted in the doorway. Lydia May stood there, a heavy trunk balanced against her hip, her father's worn Bible clutched in her free hand. "Good morning, husband," she said simply, stepping inside without waiting for invitation. Theodore sat up too quickly, his head spinning. "What are you doing here?" "Moving in," Lydia May replied, setting her trunk down with surprising grace. She surveyed the cabin's single room, taking in the scattered clothes, unwashed dishes, and general disorder with a thoughtful expression. "This place needs a woman's touch." "Now wait just a minute," Theodore protested, struggling to his feet. "You can't. This isn't—" He stumbled over both words and feet, catching himself against the wall. Lydia May ignored his protests, already rolling up her sleeves. She crossed to the cold hearth, crouching to examine the ashes. "When's the last time you swept this properly?" Before Theodore could answer, she'd located his broom and set to work, raising clouds of dust that made him cough. She moved with purpose, each stroke of the broom deliberate and efficient. "This isn't real," Theodore managed finally. "Last night was just what?" Lydia May paused in her sweeping, fixing him with those steady eyes that had unsettled him so much the night before. Just vows spoken before God and witnesses? Just a legal marriage performed by an ordained minister? "It was a joke," Theodore said weakly, though the words tasted sour in his mouth. "The Lord doesn't joke about marriage." Lydia May resumed sweeping, her voice matter-of-fact. "There's beans in my trunk. They'll need soaking if we want supper tonight." Theodore watched, dumbfounded, as she finished with the hearth and moved on to the rest of the floor. The morning light grew stronger, illuminating dust motes disturbed by her vigorous cleaning. His head still pounded, but a different kind of discomfort was growing. The realization that this woman meant exactly what she said. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Through the window, Theodore spotted several townspeople riding up, no doubt coming to witness the aftermath of last night's entertainment. "Well, if it ain't the happy couple," Hank Wilson called out as he dismounted. "Figured we'd find the bride running back to town by now." His companions laughed, but their mirth died somewhat when Lydia May appeared in the doorway, broom still in hand. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said pleasantly. "I'm afraid you've caught us in the middle of spring cleaning." The riders exchanged glances, clearly thrown by her composure. They'd come expecting tears or drama, not this calm domesticity. "You ain't really staying out here with him?" Sarah Miller asked from her saddle, disbelief clear in her voice. "Where else would a wife be but in her husband's home?" Lydia May replied. She turned back to Theodore, who still stood frozen by the wall. "The water barrel's running low. We'll need more if I'm to get these floors properly clean." The visitors lingered, making poorly concealed jabs about how long this arrangement would last. They predicted everything from Lydia May fleeing within the week to Theodore abandoning his own cabin to escape. But their words seemed to slide off Lydia May like water off a duck's back as she continued her work, somehow making even the act of sorting through Theodore's scattered belongings look dignified. As the sun climbed higher, the onlookers gradually lost interest in a spectacle that refused to provide entertainment. They rode off, no doubt to spread word through town that Lydia May Carter, now Hale, had indeed taken up residence in the mountain man's cabin. Theodore spent the day in a fog that had nothing to do with his hangover. He watched as Lydia May transformed his bachelor dwelling. She found homes for her few possessions, set beans to soak in a pot by the fire, and mended a tear in one of his shirts without being asked. Each domestic act seemed a quiet declaration. She was here to stay. As evening approached, savory smells filled the cabin. Lydia May had somehow produced a proper meal from his meager stores, and now she ladled beans and cornbread onto 2 plates. "Supper's ready," she announced, setting them on his small table. Theodore sat, still feeling like he was moving through a dream. The food was better than anything he'd eaten in months. "Thank you," he said gruffly when his plate was clean, "for the meal." And he gestured vaguely at the now tidy cabin. "For keeping a dry roof over your head, I reckon it's the least I can do." "Yes, it is," Lydia May agreed, her voice gentle but firm. She began clearing the dishes, her movements unhurried. "I mean to honor these vows, Theodore. They weren't spoken to those men at the saloon, but to God himself." Theodore shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "You deserve better than a marriage born of a drunken dare." Lydia May paused in her work, turning to look at him fully. The lamplight caught the curves of her face, softening them. "Then perhaps you'll become better." The simple statement hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Theodore opened his mouth to respond, but found he had no words. Later, he lay on his bunk, now equipped with fresh linens Lydia May had produced from her trunk, while she slept on a pallet near the hearth. Sleep eluded him as he turned her words over and over in his mind. "Perhaps you'll become better." The cabin felt different in the darkness. Cleaner, yes, but more than that. The lingering scent of supper mixed with the pine soap Lydia May used. The sound of her steady breathing joined the familiar chorus of night sounds from outside. Small changes, but somehow they made the space feel more like a home than it had in all the years he'd lived there alone. Theodore stared at the ceiling, remembering the look in Lydia May's eyes when she'd spoken about their vows. There had been no accusation there, no bitterness about the circumstances that had brought them together. Instead, he'd seen something that looked remarkably like hope. The night wore on, but still sleep wouldn't come. Every time Theodore closed his eyes, he saw Lydia May's calm face as she'd worked through the day, claiming her place in his world without apology or explanation. She hadn't tried to shame him for his actions, hadn't demanded promises or changes. She'd simply stated her truth, that their marriage was real in the eyes of God, and then gone about living as if that truth were as solid as the mountain itself. Outside, a coyote called into the darkness. Theodore listened to its lonely cry, more aware than ever of the presence of another person under his roof. Lydia May's words echoed in his thoughts, a challenge wrapped in simple faith. "Perhaps you'll become better." He shifted restlessly, unused to sheets that smelled of sunshine and soap. His entire life had been built on independence, on answering to no one but himself. Now this woman had walked into his cabin and rearranged not just his belongings, but his very understanding of consequence and commitment. The moon tracked across the sky as Theodore wrestled with thoughts he'd never expected to face. What did it mean to become better? How could a marriage founded on mockery transform into something honorable? And why did Lydia May's quiet certainty unsettle him more than any amount of tears or accusations would have? Dawn broke over the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Theodore rose early, his mind already set on testing the resolve of his unexpected wife. He deliberately left the water barrel nearly empty and the wood pile low, tasks that would challenge even a sturdy man in the thin mountain air. Lydia May emerged from the cabin as the sun cleared the horizon, her hair neatly pinned beneath a faded bonnet. She took one look at the depleted supplies and squared her shoulders, gathering up the empty buckets without complaint. Theodore pretended to busy himself with his trapline, but his eyes followed her progress to the creek. The path was steep and rocky, demanding careful footwork even without the burden of full water buckets. Lydia May moved slowly, but steadily, her breath coming in visible puffs in the cool morning air. The first trip left her winded, face flushed with exertion. She paused only long enough to catch her breath before starting down the path again. Theodore watched as she made 4 more trips, each one clearly taxing her strength but never breaking her determination. When the water barrel stood full, Lydia May turned her attention to the woodpile. The axe was too heavy for her, but she gathered fallen branches and kindling, making trip after trip into the surrounding forest. Her skirts caught on brambles, and sweat darkened the back of her dress, but she persisted. By mid-morning, she had assembled enough wood to last several days. Without pausing to rest, she returned to the cabin and began preparing bread dough. Theodore followed, curious despite himself. Inside, Lydia May's strong hands worked the dough with steady motions. Though her arms trembled with fatigue, she kneaded until the texture was just right. A strand of hair had escaped her bonnet, clinging to her damp forehead, but her expression remained peaceful. The day wore on, and still she worked. Theodore found himself growing uncomfortable with his own test of her endurance. He had expected complaints, tears, or a dramatic departure back to town. Instead, Lydia May met each task with quiet perseverance that spoke of deeper strength than he had imagined. As evening approached, Theodore sat in his usual spot by the door, running a whetstone along the blade of his axe. The familiar rhythm of steel against stone filled the cabin, mixing with the sounds of Lydia May preparing their supper. Then something new joined the evening's chorus. A soft voice, rich and clear as mountain spring water, rose from where Lydia May stood stirring the cooking pot. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound of that saved a wretch like me. Theodore's hand froze mid-stroke, the whetstone hovering above the axe blade. The hymn filled the cabin with unexpected beauty, touching something long buried in his memory. Lydia May's voice carried years of practice and devotion, each note perfectly placed yet flowing naturally as a stream. I once was lost, but now am found. I was blind, but now I see. The sound wrapped around him like a warm blanket on a cold night. Theodore found himself holding his breath, afraid any movement might break the spell. This was no simple singing. It was the voice of someone who had found strength in music, who had learned to lift her spirit above earthly troubles through song. When the last note faded, silence hung in the air like morning mist. Theodore cleared his throat, struggling to find words that wouldn't sound foolish. "Haven't heard hymns since I was a boy," he finally managed, his voice rougher than usual. "My ma used to sing them, before she passed." Lydia May stirred the pot slowly, considering his words. "My father taught me every hymn he knew," she said. "Said songs were gifts from the Lord, meant to lift our burdens when they grew too heavy." She paused, adding a pinch of salt to the stew. "Folks in town used to ask me to sing at church. That was before they decided my size made me more suitable for mockery than music. But they couldn't take the songs from my heart, even if they didn't want to hear them anymore." The simple statement held no bitterness, only a quiet acceptance that spoke of hard-won peace. Theodore looked at her with new eyes, seeing past the shape that had drawn so much cruel attention. Here was a woman who had found a way to preserve her dignity despite years of ridicule, who had kept her gift alive even when others tried to silence it. "Reckon some folks don't recognize true value when they see it," Theodore said gruffly, surprising himself with the words. Lydia May glanced at him, a flash of something like gratitude crossing her face before she turned back to her cooking. "Supper's nearly ready," she said softly. The meal passed in thoughtful silence. Afterward, Theodore stepped outside, needing space to sort through the evening's revelations. He lit his pipe, the familiar ritual helping to steady his spinning thoughts. Above him, stars pricked through the darkening sky like pinpoints of light through a blanket. The mountain air carried the sharp scent of pine and the distant cry of a lone wolf. Theodore drew deeply on his pipe, letting the smoke curl up toward the heavens. The woman inside his cabin was not who he had thought she was. He had assumed, like everyone else, that her size defined her entirely. But her voice, that unexpected gift of grace and power, had revealed something else entirely. She possessed a strength that had nothing to do with muscle and everything to do with spirit. Through the cabin's window, lamplight cast a warm glow into the gathering darkness. Theodore could see Lydia May's shadow moving as she finished the evening's tasks, and the memory of her singing seemed to hover in the air around him. He felt both haunted and comforted by it, like a man who had stumbled upon something precious without meaning to. He had meant to challenge her today, to prove she wasn't fit for mountain life. Instead, she had proven something entirely different. Every bucket of water carried, every branch gathered, every hour spent kneading bread had demonstrated a quiet determination he hadn't expected. And then that voice, that remarkable voice she had kept safe inside herself despite years of mockery, had shown him there were depths to Lydia May Carter that no one in town had bothered to see. Theodore tapped out his pipe against the cabin wall, the sharp sound cutting through his reverie, He had married her as a drunken joke, expecting her to flee back to town in tears. Now he found himself sharing his home with a woman of hidden strength, whose voice could fill an empty cabin with glory, and whose hands could turn daily burdens into acts of dignity. He wasn't sure what to make of it all, but he knew one thing with certainty. Lydia May was not the pitiful creature he had assumed her to be. She was something else entirely, someone with an inner fortitude that matched the very mountains surrounding them. Sunday morning dawned clear and crisp over Silverton. The church bell's iron voice echoed through the valley, calling the faithful to worship. Theodore shifted uncomfortably in his best shirt, still rough and weathered but cleaner than his usual attire. Beside him, Lydia May walked with measured steps, her plain dress neat and pressed despite its age. As they approached the white-painted church, conversations died away. Women whispered behind raised hands, men's faces twisted with poorly hidden smirks. Theodore felt his jaw tighten, watching how Lydia May kept her eyes forward, her composure a shield against their stares. Inside, they found a pew near the back. The usual rustling of cloth and creaking of boards filled the air as the congregation settled. Theodore noticed how people left empty spaces around them, as if their presence might be catching. Pastor Reed stood at his pulpit, fingers nervously adjusting his collar. His eyes skipped over their section as he began the service, his voice carrying less conviction than usual. The hymns rose and fell, but Lydia May remained silent beside Theodore, though he could sense her longing to join in. After the sermon, as was custom, Pastor Reed made announcements about new arrivals, births, and marriages. When he reached recent unions, he hesitated, his gaze darting toward their pew before quickly looking away. "And we have had other ceremonies," he said vaguely, clearing his throat, though perhaps some might not fully count in the eyes of proper society. The words hung in the air like smoke. A few snickers rippled through the congregation. Theodore felt Lydia May stiffen beside him, though her face remained composed. Town Elder Marcus Whitfield stood up, his voice carrying clearly through the church. "Pastor, surely you're not recognizing that mockery of matrimony. It was nothing but a drunken jest, an embarrassment to our good Christian community." Murmurs of agreement followed. More townspeople stood, adding their voices to the protest. "It's a disgrace, makes light of sacred vows. Someone ought to put a stop to it." Pastor Reed raised his hands weakly, trying to calm the growing storm. Now, let's not forget Christian charity." But his words were lost as more people joined in, their righteous indignation feeding on itself. Theodore watched as Lydia May's hands tightened on her Bible, her knuckles white with tension. Finally, unable to bear more, Theodore stood. His height and broad shoulders commanded attention, and the church fell quiet. "Reckon we've heard enough," he said, his voice rough but controlled. "Come on, Lydia May." She rose with dignity, and they walked out together. The sound of renewed whispers followed them through the door. The trip back to the cabin was silent, broken only by the crunch of their boots on the path. As they approached home, Theodore finally spoke, his words coming out in a frustrated rush. "Listen, if you want to annul this whole thing, I wouldn't blame you. Maybe they're right. It was a fool thing, done in drink. You deserve better than being tied to a rough mountain man and all this shame." Lydia May didn't respond immediately. Instead, she went inside and retrieved an envelope from her trunk. The paper was worn, but carefully preserved, sealed with wax and bearing official markings. "There's something you should know," she said, holding out the envelope. "This was my father's final gift to me." Theodore took it carefully, breaking the seal. Inside was a deed, the formal language clear despite the paper's age. As he read, his eyes widened. "This is for the North Valley property," he said slowly, "with the year-round spring." Lydia May nodded. The same spring the town's been trying to claim. Father knew its value. Clean water that never runs dry, even in drought years. He left it to me, knowing the town would try to take it if they could. Theodore stared at her, understanding dawning. And now, being married. "Makes you joint owner," she finished. "By law, they can't touch it without your agreement, too." Theodore sank into a chair, the deed still in his hands. The joke marriage had suddenly become something far more significant. The town's most coveted water source now partially belonged to him, the rough trapper they had always looked down on. "They'll fight this," he said quietly. Lydia May stood straight, something fierce showing through her usual gentle demeanor. "Let them. I've spent years being overlooked, pushed aside, treated like I was nothing but a source of amusement. They tried to erase me, but they couldn't. I won't let them take what's rightfully mine, what my father entrusted to me." She took a deep breath, her voice steady. "I know this isn't what you wanted. If you choose to stand with me, it won't be easy. The town won't forgive either of us." Theodore looked at her for a long moment. The woman before him bore little resemblance to the figure of fun the town had mocked. Here was someone with steel in her spine and fire in her heart, fighting not just for land, but for her very right to exist as something more than a joke. He stood, holding out the deed to her. "I gave my word when I married you, even if I was too drunk to know what I was doing. Maybe it's time I lived up to it." His voice grew firmer. "I won't abandon you to face them alone." Lydia May took the deed, her fingers trembling slightly despite her composed expression. "Thank you," she said softly. They prepared supper together in silence, each lost in thought. The simple sounds of cooking, the scrape of the spoon against the pot, the crack of kindling in the stove, seemed louder than usual in the quiet cabin. Through the window they could see the sun setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. The gravity of their situation settled around them like a heavy blanket. What had begun as a cruel joke had transformed into a battle for survival. The town's ridicule would soon turn to something darker when they realized what was at stake. Theodore watched Lydia May moving about the cabin, noting how she held herself with quiet dignity despite everything. He had married her on a foolish dare, but now found himself bound to her cause by something stronger than mere papers, a growing respect for her courage, and a determination to prove himself better than the man who had mocked her that night in the saloon. They ate their meal in continued silence, each bite accompanied by the weight of decisions made and battles yet to come. The lamplight cast their shadows large against the cabin walls, two figures joined by circumstance but now united in purpose, facing a future neither had imagined when they had first spoken their vows. The morning sun painted the mountains gold as Theodore readied his old mule for their journey. The beast's coat was patched and graying, but its steady nature made it perfect for inexperienced riders. He watched as Lydia May emerged from the cabin, her shawl wrapped tight against the morning chill. "You ever rode before?" Theodore asked, adjusting the worn leather stirrups. "Only in a wagon," Lydia May admitted, eyeing the mule's height with uncertainty. Theodore nodded, his weathered hands gentle on the mule's neck. "Old Jake here, steady as they come. Won't give you any trouble." He helped her mount, noting how she bit her lip but didn't complain when the saddle creaked under her weight. The mule simply flicked its ears, patient as ever. Theodore took the lead rope and began walking, setting a comfortable pace along the narrow trail. The morning mist clung to the valley below them as they made their way through stands of aspen and pine. Theodore kept to the easiest paths, avoiding the steeper slopes that might frighten his passenger. Every so often, he glanced back to check on her. Lydia May sat straight-backed in the saddle, her hands gripping the pommel tight, but her face serene as she took in the mountain scenery. "It's beautiful up here," she said softly, her voice carrying in the clear air. "Father used to tell me about the high country, but I never saw it myself." Theodore grunted in acknowledgement, leading them around a bend. "Gets in your blood? Hard to stay down in town once you've lived with the mountains." The trail opened onto a small meadow, still damp with dew. At its center, water bubbled up from between moss-covered rocks, forming a clear pool before streaming away down the slope. The spring's song filled the clearing with gentle music. Theodore helped Lydia May dismount, steadying her as her boots touched the ground. She straightened her skirts and walked to the spring's edge, her steps reverent. "This is it," she said, kneeling to touch the water, "Father's pride and joy." Theodore pulled out the deed, comparing the boundary markers described on the paper to the stone cairns visible around the meadow's edge. Everything matched perfectly. The claim was legal and clear. "Your father knew what he was doing," Theodore said, tucking the deed away. "Spring like this, flowing year-round, it's worth more than gold to the right people." Lydia May nodded, still watching the water. "He used to say God put it here for a purpose." She reached for the wooden buckets they'd brought. "Best get to work." "Here now," Theodore stepped forward. "No need for you to strain yourself. I can manage the hauling." But Lydia May was already dipping the first bucket, her movements determined despite their awkwardness. "I've done my share of work before, Mr. Hale. Won't break from a little more." Theodore watched as she lifted the full bucket, her arms trembling slightly but her back straight. Something in her quiet dignity stopped him from insisting. Instead, he filled his own buckets, and they worked together in companionable silence. When the sun reached its peak, they settled in the meadow grass for a simple meal. Theodore pulled hardtack from his saddlebags while Lydia May spread a clean kerchief between them. The tough bread was plain fare, but neither complained as they shared it with fresh spring water. "Father used to come up here regular," Lydia May said, breaking the peaceful quiet. "He'd spend hours just sitting, watching the water flow." She smiled softly at the memory. Said he'd pray that it would always be here to bless the thirsty, not just people, but the deer and elk too. All God's creatures. Theodore studied her face as she spoke, seeing the same gentle strength he'd noticed in her voice when she sang. Sounds like a good man. He was. Lydia May brushed crumbs from her skirt. Taught me that everything valuable comes with responsibility. That's why he left me this spring. Knew I'd understand its worth beyond money. The afternoon sun was starting its westward slide when they finally packed up to head home. Theodore led them on a different trail, stopping at several points to show Lydia May likely spots for setting snares. Rabbits use these runs regular, he explained, demonstrating how to loop and secure the thin wire. Set them right, and you'll have fresh meat for the pot most days. Lydia May watched carefully, her attention focused on every detail. When Theodore handed her a snare to try herself, her thick fingers proved surprisingly deft at the delicate work. Near the cabin, Theodore paused at his chopping block. The split logs needed for winter were only half done, a task he'd been putting off. He picked up his axe, testing its edge. "Might as well show you this too," he said, selecting a likely log. "Never know when you might need to do it yourself." He demonstrated the proper stance, the angle of the swing, how to let the axe's weight do most of the work. Lydia May observed intently, asking questions about grain direction and knots that showed she was truly listening. The sun was setting by the time they finished the day's lessons. Theodore's shirt stuck to his back from the work, and Lydia May's face was flushed with exertion, but neither seemed to mind the tiredness. Inside the cabin, Theodore began to reach for his usual dinner of dried meat and beans, but Lydia May stopped him with a gentle hand on his arm. "Let me," she said, already moving to the hearth. "I've got something better in mind." Theodore sat at the rough table, watching as she worked with quiet efficiency, the cabin filled with rich smells he hadn't experienced in longer than he could remember. When she finally set the bowl before him, the venison stew was thick with vegetables and herbs he hadn't even known were in his stores. "Before we eat," Lydia May said softly, folding her hands, "would you mind if I said grace?" Theodore hesitated only a moment before bowing his head. Her voice was low and sweet as she thanked the Lord for their food, for the spring's clean water, for the day's safe journey. Simple words, but they settled something in Theodore's chest he hadn't known was restless. They ate in comfortable silence, broken only by the clink of spoons and the crackle of the hearth fire. The stew was the best meal Theodore had eaten in months, maybe years. He found himself taking smaller bites, trying to make it last. Looking across the table at Lydia May, Theodore saw none of the awkwardness that had marked their first days together. There was a peace between them now, fragile perhaps, but real. They had worked side by side today, each contributing what they knew, each learning from the other. As darkness settled outside and the lamp burned low, Theodore realized that for the first time since that drunken night in the saloon, he wasn't thinking of their marriage as a mistake to be undone. Whatever tomorrow might bring, today they had found a way to work together, to share knowledge and break bread in harmony. They cleared the table together, their movements falling into a natural rhythm. The quiet that filled the cabin wasn't the tense silence of strangers anymore, but the soft peace of two people beginning to understand each other. 5 days after their trip to the spring, Theodore stood in the clearing behind his cabin, watching Lydia May handle his old Winchester rifle. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the heavy weapon, but her jaw was set with determination. "Now remember," Theodore instructed, keeping his voice patient. "Stock tight against your shoulder. Lean into it some, or the kick'll knock you back." Lydia May adjusted her stance, her thick fingers wrapping carefully around the wooden stock. The target, an old tin can perched on a stump 20 yards away, gleamed in the morning sun. "Take your time," Theodore said. "Breathe steady like when you're singing them hymns." A ghost of a smile touched Lydia May's lips at the comparison. She drew a deep breath, held it, then squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked, and the can jumped, nicked but not fallen. "You clipped it." Theodore's approval was genuine. That's better than most manage first try. Lydia May lowered the rifle, rubbing her shoulder where the recoil had struck. Reckon I'll need more practice before I can hunt proper. We've got time, Theodore said, surprising himself with how natural the words felt. Winter's still a ways off. They moved on to the chicken coop Theodore had cobbled together years ago. The handful of scrawny hens barely laid enough eggs to be worth their feed, but Lydia May approached the task of caring for them with the same quiet determination she showed everything else. Poor things need a proper roost, she said, examining the rough interior. And some straw for nesting. No wonder they're not laying well. Theodore watched as she gathered eggs with gentle hands, speaking softly to the nervous birds. By the time she finished, the hens were eating corn from her palm, their previous skittishness forgotten. Never had much luck with them myself, Theodore admitted. Always seemed more trouble than they're worth. Everything's worth the trouble if you treat it right, Lydia May replied, not looking up from where she was spreading fresh straw. Even ornery chickens. The afternoon found them on the cabin's roof, where several loose shingles needed replacing before the autumn rains. Theodore showed Lydia May how to test for weak spots, how to overlap the wooden shakes properly to keep water from seeping through. Despite her size making movement awkward, Lydia May insisted on helping with the actual work. Her face shone with sweat as she hammered nails, but she never complained. When she missed the nail and struck her thumb, she simply pressed her lips together and kept working. That's enough for today, Theodore finally said, noting her fatigue. Rest of it can wait. Just a few more, Lydia May insisted, reaching for another shingle. Don't want to leave the job half done. Theodore found himself studying her face, seeing past what the town saw, past the size that made her a target for cruel jokes. He saw instead the quiet strength in her eyes, the gentle set of her mouth, the dignity that no amount of mockery seemed to touch. Their trip into town the next day proved that mockery was still plenty. The whispers started the moment they rode in. Lydia May perched carefully on the wagon seat beside Theodore. Ain't natural, them two together. Must be some trick about that spring deed. How long you reckon before he comes to his senses? Theodore felt his jaw tighten, but Lydia May touched his arm lightly. Let them talk, she said softly. Words can't hurt unless you let them. At the mercantile, the whispering grew louder. Ladies who had once been polite now turned their backs. The shopkeeper's wife watched with narrowed eyes as Lydia May examined bolts of fabric, her fingers moving carefully over the materials. Planning to pretty up that mountain shack, someone sneered from behind a shelf. Snickers followed. Lydia May selected a length of cheerful yellow calico, adding it to her basket of needed supplies. The cabin could use some curtains, she said, her voice carrying clearly. A home should have beauty as well as function. Theodore found himself standing straighter, matching her dignity. He carried her purchases to the wagon himself, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed them down the street. The ride home was quiet but not uncomfortable. Lydia May held the fabric in her lap, occasionally running her fingers over it as if drawing strength from its cheerful pattern. That evening, after supper was cleared away, she set up her sewing basket near the hearth. Theodore watched as she measured and cut the calico with sure movements, her needle flashing in the lamplight as she created neat, even seams. Never had curtains before, he said after a while, always seemed unnecessary. Sometimes the unnecessary things matter most, Lydia May replied, not looking up from her work. Like singing, or flowers, or saying grace before meals. They remind us we're more than just survival. Theodore thought about that as he cleaned his rifle, the familiar motions automatic. He thought about how the cabin had changed in the weeks since Lydia May arrived, how it was cleaner, more organized, how meals had become something to look forward to instead of just fuel to keep working, how the sound of her hymns made the evenings less lonely. Thank you, he said suddenly, the words feeling rough in his throat. Lydia May looked up, her needle pausing. What for? For... Theodore gestured vaguely at the cabin, at the half-finished curtains, at everything. For having the grit to stay. For not letting them run you off. For... He trailed off, unsure how to express what he meant. Lydia May's face softened with understanding. God gives strength where it's needed, she said simply. I reckon he knew I'd need plenty, coming up here. Theodore sat with that for a long moment, watching the firelight play across her face. He'd spent years scoffing at talk of God, seeing religion as something weak people needed for comfort. But there was nothing weak about Lydia May's faith. It was as solid as the mountains themselves, as steady as the spring's flow. He didn't say anything else, but the silence between them was comfortable, filled with the soft sounds of her sewing and the crackle of the fire. Outside, a coyote called lonely in the distance, but inside the cabin, something like peace had taken root. Sunday dawned clear and crisp with autumn's first bite in the air. Theodore watched from the cabin door as Lydia May smoothed her best dress, the dark blue cotton pressed carefully the night before. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pinned her hair, but her eyes were steady in the mirror. "You sure about this?" Theodore asked quietly. They hadn't been to church since their hasty marriage 3 weeks ago. "Yes," Lydia May answered, though her voice wavered. "It's time." Theodore nodded, adjusting his own Sunday coat, dusty from disuse but the best he had. The fabric pulled tight across his shoulders, a reminder of how long it had been since he dressed for worship. He helped Lydia May into the wagon, noting how she'd taken extra care with her appearance, even adding a touch of ribbon to her collar. The trip to town was silent, both lost in their thoughts. As they approached the white-painted church, Theodore could see folks gathering on the steps, their conversations dying as the wagon drew near. He felt Lydia May stiffen beside him, but noticed she held her head high. "Ready?" he asked, offering his arm after helping her down. "The Lord is my strength," she whispered, more to herself than him. "He ain't never failed me yet." They walked up the steps together, ignoring the stares and whispers. Some people stepped back, creating a path, while others turned away entirely. Pastor Reed, greeting congregants at the door, faltered visibly when he saw them, but managed a weak welcome as they passed. Inside, Theodore guided Lydia May to a pew near the back, where he'd sat as a boy before drifting away from faith. The familiar smell of polish and hymn books brought unexpected memories. His mother's voice, his father's steady hands turning pages, peace he'd long forgotten. The service began, as always, with announcements and prayer requests. Theodore noticed how the usual petitions for sick relatives and struggling farms carefully avoided mentioning them or the spring water dispute. When Pastor Reed called for the first hymn, Theodore felt Lydia May draw a deep breath beside him. "Number 123, the pastor announced, Amazing Grace. The piano started, a bit thin and wobbly, and the congregation began to sing. Then, clear as morning light, Lydia May's voice rose above the others. Theodore felt it first as a vibration in the wooden pew, then as something that filled his chest with warmth. The effect on the church was immediate. Voices faltered, heads turned, and within moments, only Lydia May's voice remained, pure and strong. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Her voice carried every word as if it were a testimony, rich with meaning and memory. Theodore saw tears begin to fall on women's cheeks. Men shifted uncomfortably, then bowed their heads. Even Pastor Reed stood transfixed, his own hymnal forgotten. I once was lost, but now am found, and was blind, but now I see. Without conscious thought, Theodore reached for Lydia May's hand. She gripped it tightly, her voice never wavering as she continued through all the verses. When she reached the last line, other voices had begun to join her again, hesitant at first, then stronger until the small church rang with harmony. As the last note faded, silence held for a long moment. Theodore heard someone blow their nose softly. A child whispered, "Mama, why are you crying?" Pastor Reed had to clear his throat twice before he could continue the service. Throughout the sermon, Theodore remained aware of Lydia May's hand in his, of the subtle trembling that belied her calm exterior. He'd never held her hand in public before, had barely touched her since their mockery of a wedding. Now it felt as natural as breathing. The next hymn began, and again Lydia May sang, her voice adding depth and grace to the simple tune. This time, the congregation joined in readily, and Theodore found himself humming along, remembering words he thought he'd forgotten. After the service, people lingered in the aisle. Theodore tensed, expecting more mockery, but the atmosphere had shifted. Mrs. Peterson, who'd turned her back at the mercantile just days ago, approached with reddened eyes. "Lydia May," she said softly, "I'd forgotten how you used to lead the youth choir. Would you consider helping with the Christmas program? The children always did better with your guidance." Before Lydia May could answer, others pressed forward. "Your voice is a gift," someone said. "A true blessing," added another. Even Pastor Reed made his way over, looking somewhat ashamed. "The church has missed your voice, Sister Lydia," he said. Perhaps we all lost sight of what matters most to our Lord." Theodore watched as Lydia May accepted each comment with gentle dignity, neither spurning the sudden kindness nor drawing attention to the previous cruelty. She promised to think about the Christmas program, thanked people for their welcome, and maintained her composure until they were well outside. In the wagon heading home, Theodore heard the first sob. He pulled the horses to a stop and turned to find Lydia May weeping quietly, her handkerchief pressed to her face. "I'm sorry," she managed between tears. I didn't know if I could do it, if they'd let me, if my voice would even come." Theodore found himself wrapping an arm around her shoulders, drawing her close. "You did more than sing," he said roughly. "You showed them what courage looks like. What faith looks like." She leaned against him, her tears gradually slowing. "I've missed it so much," she whispered. "Not just the singing, but feeling part of something bigger. Something holy." Theodore was quiet for a moment, sorting through emotions he'd long buried. "I reckon I forgot what that felt like," he finally said. "Being part of something holy. Lost it somewhere between my mama's passing and taking to the mountains. But hearing you sing today?" He paused, struggling to find words. "It was like something broken got mended. Something I thought was lost for good." Lydia May lifted her face, studying him with tear-bright eyes. "Faith?" "Faith," he nodded. "In God. Maybe. In goodness for certain." He cleared his throat. "Thank you for that gift." She smiled then, a real smile that transformed her face. "His amazing grace," she said softly. "It finds us all, sooner or later." They rode the rest of the way home in comfortable silence, the autumn sun warming their shoulders. Theodore found himself humming Amazing Grace under his breath, the tune carrying memories of his mother, of childhood peace, of something long buried now rising toward light. At the cabin, before helping Lydia May down, Theodore kept hold of her hand. "Would you sing it again?" he asked. "Here, just for us?" And there in the yard, with only the mountains as witness, Lydia May sang. Her voice rose clear and true, carrying praise to the sky, while Theodore stood with bowed head, feeling his heart crack open to let grace back in. The morning after church brought unwelcome visitors to Theodore and Lydia May's cabin. 3 men in crisp suits rode up on gleaming horses, their city boots barely dusty despite the long trail. Behind them, 2 of Silverton's town elders followed on their own mounts, looking uncomfortable but determined. Theodore had been splitting wood, and he kept the axe in his grip as the men dismounted. Lydia May appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mr. Hale," the tallest railroad man said, tipping his hat. "Mrs. Hale, I'm James Whitfield, representing the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad Company." He gestured to his companions. "These are my associates, and I believe you know Mr. Peterson and Mr. Barnes from town." Theodore nodded curtly but didn't offer his hand. "What brings railroad men to my property?" Whitfield smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Progress, Mr. Hale. The railroad is expanding through this valley, and we've heard tell of a particular spring on your land, one that flows year-round, even in drought." "The spring ain't for sale," Theodore said flatly. "Now let's not be hasty." Whitfield pulled a folded document from his coat. "We're prepared to make a very generous offer. The railroad needs reliable water sources for our steam engines, and this location is ideal." Mr. Peterson stepped forward, his usual bluster subdued. "Theodore, be reasonable. This could bring real prosperity to Silverton. Jobs, commerce, connection to the outside world." "The spring stays where it is," Theodore repeated. He felt Lydia May move to stand beside him, her presence steady and sure. Whitfield's smile tightened. "Mr. Hale, perhaps you don't understand. The railroad is coming through this valley one way or another. We're offering you a chance to profit from the inevitable." "What my husband understands," Lydia May said quietly, "is that this spring was entrusted to us by my father, who believed water should bless all who thirst, not just those who can pay for it." The railroad man barely glanced at her. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this is a business matter. Surely your husband can see reason." Theodore's grip tightened on the axe handle. "My wife speaks for both of us. The spring ain't for sale, and that's final." Mr. Barnes, who had remained silent until now, cleared his throat. Theodore, don't be foolish. Think about your future, about children you might have someday. His eyes slid meaningfully to Lydia May, then away. Theodore took a step forward, but Lydia May's hand on his arm stopped him. Our future, she said firmly, includes keeping our promises. To my father, to this land, and to God. Whitfield's facade of friendliness disappeared. Very well. But understand this. Progress doesn't wait for sentiment or superstition. There are other ways to secure what we need. He turned to his horse, then looked back. I'd reconsider if I were you before things become difficult. They watched the men ride away, dust settling in their wake. Theodore's muscles were tight with anger. That was a threat, he growled. Yes, Lydia May agreed softly, but we knew this day would come. Theodore drove his axe into the chopping block with enough force to embed it deep. If they think they can intimidate us, they'll try, Lydia May said, but we'll stand firm. With dignity. That evening, they ate their supper in uneasy silence, both watching the darkening windows. Theodore cleaned his rifle and kept it close, while Lydia May mended by lamplight, her needle moving steady and sure through rough fabric. The attack came near midnight. Theodore jolted awake to the sound of splintering wood and rushing water. He grabbed his rifle and ran outside, Lydia May following with the lantern. Their water troughs lay in ruins, broken apart by axe strokes. The spring's flow, usually channeled neatly into the drinking troughs and irrigation ditches, now ran wild across the yard. In the lantern light, Theodore could see fresh boot prints in the mud. Stay here, he told Lydia May, already moving to follow the tracks. Theodore, she called after him, don't do anything rash. He paused, the rifle heavy in his hands. They can't get away with this. They won't, she agreed. But not through violence, please. The tracks led toward town just as Theodore had expected. He followed them as far as the main road, where they disappeared among other hoof prints and wagon ruts. His blood burned hot, imagining the smug faces of the railroad men, the weak compliance of the town elders. When he returned to the cabin, he found Lydia May had already begun cleanup, gathering broken boards by lantern light. She looked up as he approached. Did you find them? Tracks led to town. He set the rifle aside and began helping her. We both know who did this. Knowing isn't proving, she said quietly, and proving isn't what matters most. Theodore straightened, frustration boiling over. Then what does matter? We're supposed to just let them destroy our property? Wait for worse to come? Lydia May set down her armload of wood. What matters is how we respond, whether we let their darkness pull us down to their level, or whether we stand in the light. Sometimes standing in the light gets you shot, Theodore muttered, and sometimes throwing the first punch makes you the wrongdoer, no matter how justified you feel. She touched his arm gently. I've lived with people's cruelty a long time, Theodore. I learned that meeting it with more cruelty only spreads the poison. Theodore paced the yard, boots splashing through puddles. I don't know if I'm strong enough for this, Lydia May. I've always fought back. It's all I know. Then maybe it's time to learn something new. She moved to stand in his path, forcing him to stop. True strength isn't in how hard you can hit back. It's in how steady you can stand while others try to knock you down. He looked down at her, this woman he'd married as a joke, who now stood before him teaching wisdom he'd never learned in all his years in the mountains. How do you do it? Stay so steady. Faith, she said simply. In God's justice, which comes in His time, not ours. In the power of truth to outlast lies. In the strength that comes when we choose right over easy. Theodore ran a hand through his hair, feeling the anger drain away, leaving exhaustion in its wake. I reckon I'm still learning about faith. We all are, Lydia May said softly. Every day. She looked around at the mess. For now, let's fix what we can. Tomorrow we'll go to the sheriff, file a proper complaint. We'll document the damage, gather witnesses if we can find any. We'll fight this the right way. They worked through the rest of the night, salvaging what wood they could, digging temporary channels to control the spring's flow. As dawn began to lighten the sky, Theodore watched Lydia May working steadily despite her obvious tiredness. Her faith wasn't just in words, he realized, but in patient action, in the quiet certainty that doing right mattered more than doing what felt good in the moment. You know, he said as they finally sat down to rest. When I was young, my pa used to say that any fool can throw a punch, but it takes a real man to hold one back when he's got cause to throw it. Lydia May smiled. Your pa sounds like a wise man. He was. Theodore looked at his hands, rough with calluses and small scars from years of fighting. I didn't listen too well back then. Maybe it's time I started. It's never too late to choose a better path, Lydia May said. She reached over and took his hand, her touch gentle but strong. And you don't have to walk it alone. They sat together as the sun rose, watching the spring water find new channels through the mud, already beginning to flow clear again. Theodore felt something shift inside him, like ice breaking up in spring. Maybe this was what faith felt like. Not in the absence of anger or fear, but at the choice to believe in something bigger than both. The path ahead wouldn't be easy. He could feel trouble gathering like storm clouds on the horizon. But with Lydia May beside him, her quiet strength flowing steady as the spring itself, he began to believe they might find a way through that didn't require him to become the man he used to be. We should get some sleep, Lydia May said finally, before we go to town. Theodore nodded, helping her to her feet. I reckon the sheriff won't be too happy to see us. Probably not, she agreed, but we'll go anyway, because it's right. Looking at the ruins of their water troughs, Theodore felt the old anger stir, but now it was tempered with something else, something that felt like hope, or maybe grace. Because it's right, he repeated softly, and followed his wife inside. The morning sun cast long shadows across Silverton's dusty main street as Theodore guided his wagon into town. His muscles were still sore from repairing the water troughs, but they needed supplies. The general store's bell jingled as he pushed through the door, his boot heels clicking against worn floorboards. Mr. Jenkins, the merchant, watched Theodore from behind his counter with narrowed eyes. The store was empty, save for them, morning stillness broken only by the tick of a wall clock. Need flour, Theodore said, setting his empty sack on the counter. And coffee. Jenkins didn't move. Heard about your water troubles? Did you now? Theodore kept his voice level, remembering Lydia May's words about standing in the light. Railroads offering fair price for that spring. Jenkins measured out flour with slow, deliberate movements. Shame if something happened to make you unable to work your claim. Theodore's hands tightened on the counter edge. That a threat? Just talking business, and Jenkins smiled thin. Though I heard tell you've been making threats of your own. Against honest men who are only looking to bring progress to our town. Lying won't make it truth, Theodore said. I haven't threatened anyone. Jenkins slammed the flour scoop down. You calling me a liar, mountain man? I'm calling you mistaken. Theodore fought to keep his voice steady. Now finish filling my order so I can... He's got a gun, Jenkins suddenly shouted, backing away. He's threatening me. Theodore's hands flew up, empty. I'm not... The store's door burst open, 2 deputies rushed in, weapons drawn. Don't move, Hale. This is nonsense, Theodore protested. I haven't done anything. Mr. Jenkins says different, the first deputy said, producing iron handcuffs. Says you threatened him with violence when he wouldn't sell to you. That's a lie. Theodore's temper flared, but he forced himself still as they shackled his wrists. Ask anyone. I haven't drawn a weapon. Save it for the judge, the second deputy growled. They marched him out into the street, where a small crowd had already gathered. Theodore caught glimpses of familiar faces, men he'd played cards with, women who'd bought his furs. None would meet his eyes now. They pushed him toward the jailhouse, past the saloon where this had all started with a drunken dare. Inside the jail, iron bars clanged shut. Theodore stood in the cell, hands still bound, watching the deputies retreat to their desk. Through the barred window, he could hear whispers and laughter from the growing crowd outside. Time crawled. Theodore paced his cell 7 steps each way. He thought of Lydia May, alone at the cabin. Would someone tell her? Would she believe Jenkins's lies? The doubt ate at him worse than the confinement. Around midday, a commotion rose outside. Theodore moved to the window, straining to see. Lydia May's voice carried clear above the murmurs. Where is my husband? She demanded. I want to see him. Best go home, Mrs. Hale, someone called. He'll be gone a while. Reckon now's your chance to break free, another voice jeered. No one would blame you for leaving the mountain man to his fate. Theodore pressed against the bars, heart pounding. Would she leave? It would be easier. safer. He'd never blamed her for staying after their mockery of a wedding. But this was different. This was real danger. Lydia May's voice rang out again, stronger. I stand with my husband. Before God and this town, I declare it. Theodore Hale is a good man, and that spring is our rightful property. Your lies won't change that truth. Pride and shame warred in Theodore's chest. Pride in her courage, shame that she had to defend him at all. He heard boots on the jailhouse steps. Then Lydia May appeared in the doorway. I demand to see my husband, she told the deputies. Her chin was high, though Theodore could see her hands trembling. 5 minutes, the older deputy said, not unkindly. That's all we can allow. Lydia May approached the cell. In the dim light, her eyes shone with tears she wouldn't let fall. Are you hurt? No, Theodore said softly. I'm sorry, Lydia May. I should have listened when you said trouble was coming. Did you threaten Mr. Jenkins? No, but it's my word against his. She nodded as if confirming something to herself. Then we'll fight this proper, like we discussed. I'll speak to Judge Wilson. He's a fair man when he's not being pressured. The railroad men don't have as much power as they think, she finished. Not if we stand firm in truth. She reached through the bars to touch his hand. I won't leave you here alone, Theodore. Whatever comes, we face it together. A deputy cleared his throat. Time's up, ma'am. Lydia May squeezed Theodore's fingers. I'll be back tomorrow. Keep faith. He watched her walk away, straight-backed despite the whispers that followed her. Through his window, he saw her climb into their wagon alone. No one offered to help her with the reins. The afternoon dragged into evening. Theodore refused the meager supper they offered, his appetite gone. As darkness fell, he thought of Lydia May in their cabin, alone for the first time since their marriage. Was she afraid? Was she remembering the sabotage? Wondering if more trouble would come? In the cabin, Lydia May lit the lamp and spread her sewing on the table. The familiar motion of needle and thread helped steady her hands. She'd brought home the supplies Theodore hadn't been able to buy, paying with carefully counted coins while townspeople stared. The cabin felt too quiet without Theodore's presence. No boot scrape on the porch, no creak of his chair by the fire. But she wouldn't give in to fear. Instead, she did what she'd always done in troubled times. She prayed. Lord, she whispered, her needle moving steady through the fabric. Give us strength for what's coming. Help Theodore keep his temper in that cell. Help me stand firm against those who drive us from this land. And if it be your will, show us the path through this valley. The lamp flickered, shadows dancing on the walls. Outside, a coyote called, answered by another far away. Lydia May kept sewing, kept praying, her faith a quiet flame in the darkness. In his cell, Theodore watched moonlight crawl across the floor. He'd never felt walls close around him like this, not in the deepest mine shaft, not in the narrowest mountain pass. But Lydia May's words echoed in his mind. Keep faith. For the first time since he was a boy, Theodore found himself forming words of prayer. They came rough and unpracticed, but sincere. Lord, he whispered to the darkness, help me be worthy of her faith in me. The night stretched long before them both. Theodore behind his bars, Lydia May at her lonely vigil. But neither was truly alone. Their prayers rose together, joining like streams flowing to the same sea, carrying hope for tomorrow's light. Miles away, their spring burbled on through the night, its water running clear and strong, heedless of the struggles of those who claimed it. Like the spring, Lydia May's faith flowed steady and pure, while in his cell, Theodore felt his own faith stirring. Like a seed, long dormant, finally reaching toward the sun. Morning crept over Silverton like a hesitant visitor. The October air bit sharp and clean, carrying the scent of wood smoke and approaching snow. Lydia May Carter Hale stood before her mirror, fingers trembling as she pinned her best brooch to her collar. The piece had belonged to her mother, a simple silver cross that caught the early light. The cabin felt hollow without Theodore's presence. His empty chair by the fireplace made her heart ache, but she squared her shoulders and gathered what she needed. Her father's worn Bible, the deed wrapped carefully in oilcloth and a small leather portfolio containing every document that proved their claim to the spring. Outside, frost crackled under her boots as she made her way to the wagon. The old mule snorted, his breath making clouds in the cold air. Lydia May checked the harness twice, hearing Theodore's patient instructions in her mind. "Always test the buckles," he'd told her. "Better safe than sorry on mountain roads." The drive into town seemed longer than usual. As she passed the outlying homesteads, Lydia noticed curtains twitching, faces turning away. News traveled fast in small towns, and everyone would know about today's hearing. Main Street was already busy when she arrived. Shopkeepers paused their morning sweeping to watch her pass. Outside the mercantile, Mrs. Jenkins gathered her skirts and hurried inside, as if Lydia's presence might soil her dress. "Well, if it ain't the mountain man's mistake," called a voice as Lydia tied the mule. She recognized Tom Wheeler, one of the men who'd been at the saloon that fateful night. "Come to set your husband free? Or finally come to your senses?" Lydia's hands shook as she gathered her documents, but she kept her chin high. Her father had always said dignity wasn't about how others treated you, but how you carried yourself before God. The courthouse steps seemed steeper than usual. Each one brought fresh whispers from the growing crowd. Look at her thinking she's proper folk now, so that poor dress straining fit to burst out of shame about Theodore getting mixed up with her. Inside, the courthouse was already half full. The town council occupied the front bench, their wives behind them in Sunday best. Railroad men in sharp suits stood near the judge's desk, speaking in low voices with the clerk. Theodore sat in chains near the front, his head bowed. He looked smaller somehow, his broad shoulders hunched beneath his prison-wrinkled shirt. When Lydia approached, his eyes lifted briefly before dropping again, shame written clear across his features. "All rise," called the bailiff as Judge Wilson entered. The old judge settled himself slowly, peering over his spectacles at the assembled crowd. His gaze lingered on Theodore's shackles, then moved to Lydia May. "We're here regarding two matters," the judge announced. "First, the assault charge against Theodore Hale. Second, the dispute over water rights to the Carter Spring." He shuffled some papers. "Mr. Jenkins, you may present your complaint." The merchant rose, straightening his vest. "Your Honor, yesterday morning that man threatened me with violence when I refused him service. He's dangerous, a wild mountain man with no respect for civilized ways." "That's not true," Theodore said, his voice rough from night in the cell. "Silent," the judge warned. "You'll have your turn." He turned back to Jenkins. "Continue." "We all know how he forced himself on this poor woman," Jenkins went on, gesturing at Lydia. "Dragged her from her bed for a mockery of marriage, just so he could claim her father's spring. Now he thinks he can bully honest businessmen." "Objection," called a quiet voice. All eyes turned to Lydia May as she stood. "Your Honor, I wasn't dragged anywhere. I chose to marry Theodore Hale." Laughter rippled through the courtroom. Judge Wilson rapped his gavel. "Mrs. Hale, you'll wait your turn to speak." The town council rose next, led by Herbert Matthews in his undertaker's black coat. "Your Honor, this is about more than one man's violent tendencies. That spring is vital to Silverton's future. The railroad needs guaranteed water rights to build the new station. We can't let progress be held hostage by what, Mr. Matthews?" Lydia asked, her voice carrying clear despite its softness. "By someone like me?" More laughter, cruel and sharp. Theodore's chains clinked as his hands clenched. "Mrs. Hale," the judge warned, "one more outburst and you'll be removed." Lydia subsided but kept her spine straight. She'd endured worse than courtroom mockery. The parade of witnesses continued, townspeople claiming Theodore had threatened them, railroad men explaining their development plans, council members insisting the spring was vital to progress. Through it all, Theodore sat silent, each accusation seeming to weight his shoulders further. Finally, Judge Wilson turned to Lydia. "Mrs. Hale, you may present your case." Lydia rose slowly, gathering her documents. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she approached the judge's desk. Whispers followed her movement. Cruel comments about her size, her walk, her audacity in appearing in court at all. "Careful there," someone called. "Don't want them boards giving way." Theodore's head snapped up at that, fury flashing in his eyes. But Lydia's calm voice cut through the laughter. "Your Honor, I hold here my father's deed to the Carter homestead, including the spring that feeds it." She unwrapped the oilcloth carefully. It was registered properly in 1863, with all water rights clearly stated. She placed the document on the judge's desk. More papers followed: survey maps, water records, her father's careful notes on flow rates and seasonal changes. My father taught me that water is life, Lydia continued, her voice growing stronger. He said whoever controls water controls the future of this land. That's why he made me promise never to sell, never to surrender our spring to those who'd use it for profit rather than sustenance. Girl's father was touched in the head, someone muttered. Everyone knows it. John Carter was a God-fearing man who understood stewardship, Lydia replied, not turning to face the speaker. The spring has served this community for 15 years, providing water to any who asked respectfully. That won't change under our care. Under your care? Matthews stood again. You expect us to believe you and your husband can manage such a vital resource? A woman of your limitations, and a man who married you as a drunken joke? The courtroom erupted in laughter. Theodore's face flushed dark with shame and anger, but Lydia stood unmoved, one hand resting on her father's Bible. My limitations, Mr. Matthews? She asked quietly. You mean my size? The way I look? The fact that men like you thought me worthless enough to be given away in a cruel joke? She turned slowly, meeting the eyes of those who had tormented her. Those aren't limitations. They're the things that taught me strength. They taught me to stand firm when others would push me down. They taught me that God's vision of our worth isn't measured by the world's standards. This is absurd, one of the railroad men interrupted. We're not here for a sermon. The town needs that water. Progress demands dash. Progress? Lydia's voice cut through his protest. Is progress built on theft and mockery? On false accusations against an honest man? On treating God's resources as commodities to be bought and sold? Your Honor, Matthews protested, surely you won't let this and this woman lecture us on morality? Judge Wilson studied the deed before him, then looked at Theodore. Mr. Hale, do you wish to speak in your own defense? Theodore rose slowly, chains rattling. His eyes found Lydia's, and something passed between them, a current of understanding stronger than shame. Your Honor, he said roughly, I've done many foolish things. Marrying Lydia May started as one of them, but it's become the most honest thing in my life. He straightened his shoulders. I never threatened Jenkins, never drew a weapon, and I won't apologize for defending my wife's rightful property. The judge nodded slowly, then turned back to Lydia. Mrs. Hale, this deed appears to be in order, but the town council raises valid concerns about the spring's management. How do you respond? Lydia opened her father's Bible, removing a carefully folded paper. I have here witness statements from 3 ranchers, 2 homesteaders, and Elder Samuel White Elk of the Ute people, all testifying to our fair management of the water since my father's passing. They'll speak to our character if your honor permits. The courtroom had grown quieter now, the earlier mockery fading as Lydia's quiet dignity began to penetrate even the hardest hearts. Theodore watched her with a mixture of pride and deep remorse, understanding at last the strength he'd failed to see that first night. Judge Wilson examined each document carefully, his expression thoughtful. The morning light through the high windows caught the silver cross at Lydia's throat, making it shine like a star against the dark fabric of her dress. She stood, straight and calm, waiting for judgment while Theodore's chains weighed heavy on his wrists and heavier still on his conscience. The laughter had died away entirely now, replaced by an expectant hush. In that silence, Theodore finally saw what he should have seen weeks ago. Not a woman to be pitied or mocked, but a soul of rare courage, teaching him by example what real strength looked like. Morning light filtered through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floors. Theodore sat in his chains, watching as Lydia entered, her Bible clutched close. She looked different today, not defeated, but determined. The usual whispers followed her, but she moved as if she couldn't hear them. Your Honor, she said, her voice clear in the morning quiet, I request permission to address the court. Judge Wilson adjusted his spectacles. Mrs. Hale, you spoke at length yesterday. What new evidence could you present? Not evidence, Your Honor, truth. Lydia's fingers traced the worn leather of her Bible. My father left me more than just a deed. He left me a song, one he wrote about this very spring. Muffled laughter rippled through the gallery. Theodore saw Matthews lean toward Jenkins, whispering something that made both men smirk. But Judge Wilson studied Lydia's face for a long moment. Very well, Mrs. Hale. though I fail to see how a song relates to water rights." Lydia nodded her thanks. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and began to sing. "Clear as crystal, fresh and free, God's waters flow for you and me. Not for profit, not for gain, but life itself, like summer rain." The first notes silenced every whisper. Theodore had heard her sing before, but never like this. Her voice filled the courthouse, rich and pure, carrying not just melody, but memory. The sound of spring water over stones, of dawn breaking over mountain peaks. In treaty kept and promise made, I'm in sharing blessed, in greed betrayed. The spring flows down from heaven's throne to nourish all, not one alone. Judge Wilson's hand reaching for his gavel fell still. Theodore watched as the older man's eyes grew damp, his stern expression softening. In the gallery, women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Even Matthews had lost his smirk. From father's father, mother's hand, the water blessed this thirsty land, not mine to sell, not mine to keep, but mine to share this blessing deep. As the last note faded, movement stirred at the back of the courtroom. Elder Samuel White. Elk rose slowly from his bench. The old man's face was weathered as canyon walls, his black eyes bright with unshed tears. "Your Honor," he said, his voice soft but carrying, "I would speak." Judge Wilson cleared his throat, clearly trying to master his emotion. "The court recognizes Elder Samuel White Elk of the Ute people." The elder moved forward with measured steps. His moccasins made no sound on the floorboards. He stopped beside Lydia, laying a gnarled hand on the Bible she held. "I knew John Carter," he said. "Knew him well. When others broke treaties, stole water rights, he honored his word to my people. That spring, we called it medicine water, gave life to all who came in peace. His daughter speaks truth through song, as our people have done since the mountains were young." Theodore watched Lydia's face. Tears tracked silently down her cheeks, but her spine remained straight, her chin high. "The water flows for all or none," Elder Samuel continued. "This is ancient law, older than your courts." John Carter understood. His daughter understands. He turned to face the gallery. "You who would steal through paper and lies, do you understand? Or has greed made you forget that water is life itself?" Matthews surged to his feet. "Your Honor, this is irregular. We can't base legal decisions on songs and Indian superstitions." "Mr. Matthews," the judge's voice cracked like a whip, "you will show respect in this court, or you will leave it. Elder White Elk's testimony is relevant and admissible." The undertaker subsided, his face mottled with anger, but something had changed in the courtroom. The earlier mockery had vanished, replaced by uncomfortable shifting, lowered eyes, cleared throats. Elder Samuel touched Lydia's shoulder gently. "Sing the last verse, daughter. Let them hear your father's heart." Lydia's voice rose again, stronger now, reaching to the courthouse rafters. "So let it flow this sacred spring until justice and mercy both take wing. For in God's sight all souls are free and to share his gifts like you and me." Theodore felt something break open in his chest. Shame and pride and love tangled together. He saw now what he'd been too blind to see that night in the saloon. The quiet dignity that no mockery could touch. The faith that ran deeper than any spring. "Your Honor," Elder Samuel said into the silence that followed, "I have witnessed many things in my years. I have seen treaties broken like dry twigs, seen promises scatter like dust in the wind. But I have also seen truth stand like mountain stone. John Carter's spring brought peace between our peoples when others brought war. His daughter carries that peace in her heart. The water rights belong with her, and with the man who has learned to honor them." Judge Wilson removed his spectacles, wiping them slowly with a handkerchief. His hands trembled slightly. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "This court has heard accusations of violence, of fraud, of improper marriage. We have seen deeds and documents, listened to testimony about progress and profit." He replaced his spectacles, surveying the crowded room. "But today, we have heard something rarer. Truth spoken in love, not anger. Wisdom that flows deeper than any legal argument." Theodore hardly dared breathe. Lydia stood motionless, her Bible pressed to her heart. Even Matthews and his cronies seemed frozen, sensing the shift in the wind. "Elder White Elk's testimony carries great weight," the judge continued, "as does Mrs. Hale's demonstration of her father's character and intent. This court cannot ignore the deeper questions of justice and stewardship raised here today." He lifted his gavel but didn't bring it down. Before I render judgment, I would ask the town council to consider, what profit is worth the cost of our souls? What progress justifies theft wrapped in legal papers? What railway is more valuable than truth sung in a father's words? The morning light had strengthened, pouring through the high windows like blessing. It caught the silver cross at Lydia's throat, the tears on Elder Samuel's weathered cheeks, the iron of Theodore's shackles. In that moment, watching his wife stand tall beside the old Ute elder, Theodore felt the last walls around his heart crumble away. He had married her as a joke, a drunken boast, but God, it seemed, had turned his mockery into miracle. The woman the town had scorned now stood as its conscience, her voice carrying truth that no amount of legal argument could answer. The courtroom remained hushed, waiting for the judge's final word, but Theodore hardly heard it. He was lost in wonder at the quiet strength of love, at how justice could flow like water, at how grace could transform a foolish man's heart. Judge Wilson's gavel struck with finality, its sharp crack echoing through the hushed courthouse. This court finds in favor of Theodore and Lydia May Hale. Their rights to the spring and surrounding lands are hereby affirmed and protected under territorial law. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Matthews slumped in his chair, face darkening like a thundercloud. The railroad men near the back doors muttered among themselves, their plans for easy water access evaporating like morning dew. Furthermore, the judge continued, adjusting his spectacles, the charges of assault against Theodore Hale are dismissed as groundless. Deputy, remove those shackles. The iron cuffs fell away from Theodore's wrists. He rubbed the reddened skin, barely noticing the discomfort. His eyes were fixed on Lydia, who stood straight and tall beside Elder Samuel White Elk, clutching her father's Bible to her chest. Mrs. Hale, Judge Wilson said, his stern face softening, your father would be proud of how you've honored his legacy today. This court thanks Elder White Elk for his testimony. He cleared his throat. Court is adjourned, The gavel fell once more. People began rising, their boots scuffing against wooden floorboards. Theodore stepped away from the defendant's table, his legs unsteady after so many hours seated. Lydia turned toward him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Town Council President Whitaker pushed through the crowd, his jowls quivering with barely contained fury. This isn't over, Hale. That spring's vital to town expansion. We'll appeal Dash. You'll do no such thing, Judge Wilson cut in, still seated at his bench. The territorial court has spoken. Unless you want to be held in contempt, I suggest you accept this ruling with whatever grace you can muster. Whitaker's mouth worked silently for a moment. Then he spun on his heel, gesturing sharply to Matthews and the other council members. They filed out, their angry muttering fading down the courthouse steps. Theodore barely noticed their departure. He crossed the space between himself and Lydia in 3 long strides, her face tilted up to his, showing no trace of the mockery she'd endured these past weeks. Only joy lived in her eyes now, and a deeper emotion that made his heart stumble in his chest. He took her hand in both of his, noting how small it seemed against his calloused palms. Without hesitation, without shame, he bent and pressed his lips to her fingers. The courtroom's remaining occupants fell silent, watching. Lydia May, he said, his voice rough with feeling. I've never been so proud as I am right now, being your husband. He straightened, but kept hold of her hand. You showed more courage than any 10 men. More faith than this whole town put together? A blush rose in Lydia's cheeks, but she didn't look away. I prayed for this moment, she whispered. Not just for the spring, but for us. That God would make something true from what started false. Elder Samuel White. Elk stepped forward, laying one weathered hand on their joined ones. The Creator works in ways we cannot see, he said softly. What men meant for mockery, he has turned to blessing. His dark eyes crinkled at the corners. The spring will flow sweeter now, I think. Theodore nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. He tucked Lydia's hand into the crook of his arm, and together they walked out of the courthouse into the bright mountain morning. The town square was crowded with people who hadn't been able to fit inside, waiting to hear the verdict. A hush fell as Theodore and Lydia appeared in the doorway. Then someone started clapping. Theodore glimpsed Martha Chen from the laundry, her weathered face beaming. Others joined in until the sound echoed off the false-fronted buildings. Not everyone celebrated, of course. Matthews and his group stood in front of the Mercantile, glowering. The railroad men had already mounted up, spurring their horses toward the depot. But Theodore found he didn't care about their disapproval anymore. He helped Lydia down the courthouse steps, mindful of her skirts. At the bottom, she paused to accept a bouquet of wildflowers from Sally Jenkins, the baker's young daughter who had often been kind to her. Other townspeople stepped forward. The seamstress who had employed Lydia, the elderly couple whose linens she mended, even the pastor's wife who had once turned away when others mocked. "Your singing brought me back to my mama's church in Georgia," one woman said, pressing Lydia's hand. "I forgot what that felt like till today." "John Carter was a good man," added old Mr. Peterson, doffing his hat. "Did right by everyone, red or white. Good to see his springs in proper hands." Theodore stood beside his wife, watching her accept these gestures with the same quiet grace she'd shown through all the previous cruelty. No triumph or smugness marked her features, only gratitude, and that deep-rooted faith that had drawn him like a lodestone these past weeks. Finally, they made their way to where Theodore's mule waited, patient as ever at the hitching post. He helped Lydia mount, then swung up behind her. Elder Samuel White Elk raised his hand in farewell as they turned toward home. The road wound up into the hills, aspen leaves shimmering gold in the morning light. Neither spoke for a long while, content to listen to the mule's steady hoofbeats and the wind in the pines. Theodore's arms encircled Lydia's waist, and he marveled at how right it felt, how natural when once he'd been so reluctant to touch her. They passed the spring, its clear water bubbling up from deep in the earth. Lydia asked to stop, so Theodore helped her down. They stood together beside the pool, watching the play of light on water. "Your father was wise," Theodore said quietly, "about the spring being a blessing for all." Lydia nodded. "He used to say water was God's way of teaching us to share." She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "I never thought, that night in the saloon, that you'd understand that too." Theodore's chest tightened with remembered shame. "I was a fool that night, drunk on whiskey and my own pride." He took her hands in his. "But you saw something better in me, even then. Believed in it strong enough to stay." "God's grace is bigger than our foolishness," Lydia said softly. "I learned that from Papa, too." Theodore drew her closer, one hand rising to cup her cheek. "I mean to spend the rest of my life being worthy of that grace," he said. "And of you." Her eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant as dawn. Theodore bent and kissed her properly this time, not the stiff peck of their wedding night, but a true husband's kiss, gentle and sure. The spring sang beside them and the aspens whispered overhead, and Theodore knew with bone-deep certainty that he was finally, truly home. They remounted and continued up the trail, the mule picking its way carefully over the familiar path. The cabin came into view, their cabin now, truly shared. Smoke rose from the chimney where their neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, had promised to keep the fire going during the trial. Theodore helped Lydia down for the last time that morning. They stood together looking at their home. The morning glory vines Lydia had planted were beginning to climb the porch posts. A patch of turned earth marked where she planned an herb garden. His tools hung neatly by the door, no longer scattered where he'd dropped them. "We've got work ahead," he said. "Building proper irrigation channels, fixing up the house, dealing with whatever the town throws at us next." Lydia squeezed his hand. "Together," she said simply. Theodore nodded, his throat tight again. "Together," he agreed. They crossed the threshold side by side, weary but victorious, leaving the weight of old hurts and mockeries behind them. Through the open door, they could hear the distant sound of the spring, singing its eternal song of grace and second chances. Theodore worked steadily in the late afternoon sun, his saw rasping through fresh pine boards. The broken water troughs needed replacing before nightfall. Sweat dampened his shirt as he measured, cut, and nailed each piece into place. From time to time, he glanced toward the cabin where smoke curled from the chimney. Through the window, he could see Lydia moving about, tending the cook fire and preparing their evening meal. The crunch of wagon wheels made him look up. 3 rigs approached, carrying families from town. He recognized the Petersons, the Chens, and the Rodriguez clan. They pulled up to the yard, looking uncertain, each wagon loaded with covered dishes and baskets. Martha Chen stepped down first, clutching a steaming apple pie. We came to help," she said softly. "If you'll have us." Lydia appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. Instead of coldness or reproach, her face showed only welcome. "Of course," she said warmly. "There's plenty of work and food enough to share." The visitors shuffled forward, offering awkward apologies along with their pies and stews. Lydia accepted both with equal grace, directing the men to help Theodore while she and the women set up supper on the porch. Theodore watched his wife move among their former tormentors, her forgiveness as natural as breathing. She served them the same stew she'd prepared for him, added their offerings to the table, and spoke kindly to each person as if the past weeks of cruelty had never happened. Later, after their guests had gone home, Theodore and Lydia sat together on the porch bench. The setting sun painted the mountains gold and pink while flickering lamplight spilled from their window. "I reckon I was wrong about a lot of things," Theodore said quietly, "including our marriage." He took her hand, running his thumb over her knuckles. "What started as foolishness has turned out to be God's wisdom instead." Lydia's fingers tightened on his. "His ways aren't our ways," she said softly, "but they're always better." The first heavy snow blanketed the mountains in white silence. Theodore stood on the cabin porch, watching Lydia struggle with the snowshoes he'd crafted for her smaller feet. Her cheeks were rosy from cold and effort as she wobbled like a newborn colt. "Small steps," he guided, steadying her elbow. "Let the shoe do the work." Lydia nodded, determination set in her jaw. She pushed forward, gaining confidence with each stride until, whoosh, she tumbled face first into a drift. Instead of frustration, her laughter rang out across the snow-hushed valley. Theodore couldn't help but join in, helping her up as powder dusted her coat. "I reckon you're taking to mountain life better than most," he said, brushing snow from her shoulders. Back at the cabin, Theodore showed her how to split logs with the heavy axe. Though her arms trembled, she persisted until she could crack smaller pieces for kindling. Her triumph shone brighter than the winter sun on snow. That evening, they shared a meal of roasted rabbit and root vegetables. The firelight danced on the walls as Lydia worked on a quilt, her needle flashing steady and sure. Her voice rose in a hymn, filling their home with warmth deeper than the hearth could provide. "Come spring," she said between verses, "we could plant a proper garden, maybe even raise some young'uns someday." Her eyes met his, hopeful and shy. Theodore felt something shift in his chest, a softening he'd never expected. He watched her sing and sew, this woman who'd turned mockery into blessing. For the first time in years, he bowed his head willingly. "Lord," he prayed, his voice rough with emotion, "thank you for seeing what I couldn't. Thank you for giving me a wife whose worth shines brighter than gold." He reached for Lydia's hand, and together they sat in the peaceful glow of hearth and hope. Word spread through Silverton that the railroad men had packed their surveying equipment and departed. Their dreams of claiming the spring dissolved like morning frost. The water rights battle was truly over. One crisp morning, Pastor Reed's boots creaked up the cabin's wooden steps. He removed his hat, twisting it in weathered hands as he faced Theodore and Lydia. "I've come to make things right," he said, voice thick with remorse. "I failed you both when I performed that first ceremony without proper respect. Let me bless your union as it deserves, before God and the whole congregation." Lydia's eyes welled with tears as she squeezed Theodore's hand. "We would be honored, Pastor." The following Sunday, sunshine streamed through the church's windows, painting golden patterns across the wooden floors. Lydia stood resplendent in a dress of deep blue cotton, every careful stitch sewn by her own hands through long winter evenings. The fabric draped gracefully over her figure, adorned with delicate white lace at collar and cuffs. Theodore, cleaned up and wearing his best coat, couldn't take his eyes off her. This time, when he spoke his vows, each word carried the weight of hard-won truth. "I take thee, Lydia May Carter, to be my wedded wife." The congregation sat hushed and humbled, many wiping away tears. When Pastor Reed pronounced them man and wife anew, Lydia's voice rose clear and strong in her favorite hymn. One by one, the townspeople joined in, their voices lifting to the rafters in harmony. Theodore felt his throat tighten as he held Lydia's hand. This blessing wasn't born of whiskey and cruel jests, but of God's grace working through months of patience, forgiveness, and love. Looking at his wife's radiant face, he knew with certainty that their marriage had been sanctified not by men's approval, but by something far greater. The mountain snow melted into rivulets, feeding the spring that bubbled up from the earth like God's own blessing. Tender green shoots pushed through the soil as spring settled over the Colorado highlands. Theodore and Lydia May walked hand in hand along the well-worn path to their spring. Their footsteps matched in easy rhythm. The water flowed crystal clear over smooth stones, catching the morning light like scattered diamonds. "Reckon this is the finest spring in all of Silverton?" Theodore said softly, squeezing Lydia's hand. She smiled up at him, her cheeks rosy in the cool morning air. Together they worked the rich soil near the spring, marking straight rows with string and stakes. Theodore's strong hands broke the earth while Lydia carefully placed corn seeds, each one a promise for tomorrow. The spring's gentle music accompanied their labor. "Our children will drink from this water," Lydia said, resting a hand on her back as she straightened. "Just like my father dreamed." Theodore paused in his work, looking at his wife with tender eyes. "Our children will know the worth of both water and faith," he agreed. As evening settled over their homestead, lamplight warmed the cabin's interior. Theodore sat by the fire, his knife moving steadily over a piece of pine wood. Curls of cedar-scented shavings fell at his feet as the cradle took shape beneath his careful hands. Lydia's voice rose soft and sweet as she worked at her mending, filling their home with an old hymn about God's provision. The melody wrapped around them like a warm blanket, peaceful and sure. When the song ended, they bowed their heads together, hands clasped in the quiet moment. Their prayer rose up with gratitude for the spring, for their love, for the future growing as steady as the corn they'd planted. What had begun as a cruel joke in a saloon now stood as testament to God's ability to transform mockery into miracle, shame into dignity, and two wounded hearts into one strong union. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.